see so many of you here, both in person and online, as we gather together to reflect and maybe think critically through things that are some of the key opportunities and challenges in the realm of energy and climate policy at the moment. So in this volatile time for energy and climate policy, what are some of those key opportunities, key challenges and developments that shape our landscapes today? And what are some of the things that we need to be mindful of now that might be emerging trends that are on our policy horizons? And for those of you familiar with the Center for Energy Ethics, you will know that these kinds of questions are very much at the heart of our thinking and activities. And from the beginning, we have tried to create a space where those policy questions can be interrogated and addressed. And this led to the emergence of PEPtalks, policy engagement practice seminars, some 3 years ago, where we bring policy experts to share their experiences, their skills, and their knowledge with members of the center and our affiliates. And then in September, it led us to the launch of MSc in Energy Policy and Finance to create a cohort of scholars, of practitioners with the skills of engaging in the policy realm and the knowledge and the insights to take it forward and create better energy futures. So in a way, the event today brings both those strands together. It is a combination of a PEPtalk policy engagement practice seminar, but also a final session of a module during our MSc on energy and climate change policy. The first part of the event will be structured around student questions. So I will move on to introducing our fantastic panelists in just a second. But the students, and this is for the benefit particularly of our online audience, have been asked to reflect on the learning in the semester, to come up with the questions to pose to shape the debate today. And from all the submissions, we've selected a number of questions, and those students will be asked to stand and pose their questions to the panel. In the latter part of the session, there is going to be time and space for some open Q&A. So do listen intently, and if there's any questions that you would like to pose at the end, there will be a chance either by raising your hand in the room or popping your question into the online chat if you are joining us online. Okay, so I think this is all in terms of an introduction from me, because much more introductions are just about to follow. I am incredibly grateful to our three panelists for taking up our invitation to join us today. And we are very lucky to be joined by Dr. Jamie Speirs, who is the Reader and Deputy Director in the Centre for Energy Policy at Strathclyde University, where he investigates the social, technical and economic issues affecting energy systems and emission reduction in the UK, Europe, but also in a wider global aspect. He has 70 years experience in energy techno-economic research and currently works in a number of areas, including decarbonization of domestic heat and related energy networks, use of hydrogen in existing gas structures, and the future of critical materials for the energy sector. And he regularly provides expert evidence and analysis to a range of non-academic stakeholders, including government and the industry. Also with us is Dr. Fraser Stewart, who is the Just Transition and Communities Lead and Energy Nonprofit Regen. Within the nonprofit, Fraser heads up work on fuel poverty, community and local ownership, and the equitable sharing of social and economic value through the energy transition. This covers everything from embedding principles of justice in system planning, markets, policy and regulation, to citizen and community participation. And alongside this, he sits on the Scottish Government's Fuel Poverty Advisory Panel and was one of the founding members of Glasgow Community Energy. He holds a PhD from University of Strathclyde related to these topics. And last but not least, we have Dr. Cornelia Helmcke, who is a Senior Policy Fellow here at the Centre for Energy Ethics. As political ecologist, she has studied various land use struggles associated with global net zero ambitions and is committed to community and policy engagement in finding just transition pathways. She has a particular interest in those struggles associated with net zero strategies, such as renewable electrification and ecosystem restoration. Her book, Engineering Reality, was published with Palgrave Macmillan in 2023, and at the Centre for Energy Ethics, she has coordinated numerous submissions to parliamentary calls for evidence and recently led on a policy report on resolving the energy trilemma across the Scottish Islands. So we have some fantastic experts here with us today. Welcome. And I'm going to sit down at this stage. and grab a seat. And as promised, there's, I'm sure, many questions in the room, but we are starting today with questions proposed by our MSc students, starting with Ben Smith. If you can stand up and ask your question, please.
Yep. Is that the mic or is that the mic?
That's the mic.
That's mic, okay. During the March power outage at Heathrow, I observed online voices and outlets falsely blaming the incident on net zero. With that, I saw early parallels to DEI in the US, so EDI in the UK, which escalated from a right-wing buzzword into a full-blown political backlash, effectively killing many DEI efforts. Is the term net zero too on a path towards hyper-politicization? What can policymakers and communicators do to make net zero policies politically resilient?
That's a really, really great question. Not an easy one, though. Is there anyone of our panelists that would like to start?
Can I go first? First, I'm going to apologise. It looks like I'm texting on my phone, but I don't have a pad, so I'm going to take this there. And I very much appreciate your jumper. It's, for those who can't see it, it's an old Course St Andrews golf jumper, and it's a wonderful institution to represent. So I think this is a trend that we will continue to see around net zero, that it will be used as a blame phrase. So we've just seen that recently with the issues around steelworks in the UK and whether or not they were collapsing and needed to be nationalised because, and I think Ed Miliband was directly blamed by some political commentators that it was net zero policies that managed. And of course, net zero policies have an impact on lots of aspects of the economy, and steel uses a lot of energy, so of course net zero policies are going to impact profitability of steel. But I think that for those who want to be detractors of the issue, net zero can be used divisively for a bunch of reasons. I think so. Chris Stark, who was the head of the Climate Change Committee, he was previously a Scottish Government head of energy, and he now runs a thing called Mission Control or Clean Power 2030, depending on what they're allowed to call it on any given day. He has said previously that he thinks that the phrase net zero, while he was still head of the committee, that net zero is maybe outlived its usefulness as a term, and he got a lot of backlash for that because it sounded as though he was kind of maybe the target is not right. I think his point was really that the rhetoric has got a little bit messed up, and maybe it's not a useful term. So it's definitely become political, but anything that becomes the kind of talisman phrase for a broad set of policies will, become a political football, and it's hard to avoid that. And maybe some of the intent behind the phrase net zero is acknowledges that we're trying to get to very low emissions, but that there needs to be some wriggle room, which is what the net is for in that phrase net zero, and that has completely been lost. And so maybe Chris was right, and maybe net zero is just not a useful term. I don't necessarily think, and there has been a debate about this, that maybe 2 or 3 months ago there was results of a public attitude survey suggesting that was reported in the media as suggesting that there was a kind of rolling back on public attitude towards net zero. And there's some debate about whether some of those questions were unfairly framed or unfairly reported. It's clear that there are headwinds for net zero, but the UK still has very strong policy commitment and effort behind net zero. Clean Power 2030 as a unit within government that's got a very specific remit to increase renewables on a very short time scale. A national energy company now in the UK, called GB Energy, that's basically given the remit to help push forward a lot of that development, and that includes community energy efforts. The establishment of NESO, so a nationally owned infrastructure organisation that's supposed to help coordinate this very complicated infrastructure development phase. Those are all signals that there's still strong commitment. But it's clear that UK politics and global politics around this are messy at the moment, and there's a whole bunch of political factors that make that the case. And I'll stop going on and on then.
Fraser.
Yeah, I think that was really useful. I'm a political scientist at heart, so I'd like to get into the politics of it and start with who is weaponising the narrative of net zero for political gain. And the answer, ostensibly, is the far right, or the centre right, who lean far right when it suits them, when they see it as politically expedient. The reason that they're using that narrative is because net zero in the round, it's not just about building the wind farms, which opposition's been around to wind farms for years and years. That's a different question, I think. It's a little bit about the pylons and the infrastructure, the big stuff that has to happen, but it will eventually has to affect you in your home, right? You have to change out your gas boiler for a heat pump. You're going to have to change how you get around your town, your city, whether that's a car, public transport, whatever it might be. It has direct effects on all of us in our houses, in our communities. And it also has costs associated with it. Now, notwithstanding the fact that the costs of not doing net zero and not tackling climate change will forever far outweigh the costs of actually delivering it, that makes it a very neat little soundbite for the far right to march on. So when we think about net zero, they tie it to what's it going to do to you in your home, and use it as a scapegoat, anywhere that they can in something like Heathrow or wherever else it might rear its head. But I want to dig in beneath that, because they use it cynically, but there's a reason that it lands, and there's a reason that they make it the focus of, or will make it the focus, increasing focus of the culture war going forward to the election in 2029. It's because we know there will be costs for people as this happens. We know that without care, there is a big risk that actually people who can't afford to buy a heat pump will be excluded, will face higher network charges on their bills, will have to be exposed to volatile international gas prices going forward. There's legitimacy in that claim. The way to undercut that is not, I think, by just cracking on and getting it done, which needs to be done anyway. We can't afford to stop or slow down on this. But it means recognising that actually there is a justice, a fairness and equality element to all of this that if we're not proactive about, can very easily be tapped into for those cynical purposes. Because far-right support, it's not just about net zero. Net zero is just the latest thing, the latest lightning rod in a much broader perspective here. Far-right support, I want to, before I say the next thing, which might be controversial, but I want to qualify it by saying far-right support is not unique to any one class group or social, economic, political demographic. Far-right support spans socio-economic conditions. But where it takes off in working class communities tends to be at the back end of what we've just seen in the last 15 years, which is rampant austerity, hollowing out community power, hollowing out spending power, social, political, organisational power, which gives people that sort of, well, I say gives people, it sort of sends people into a bit of either to the political extremes like the far right, or into this sort of numbness toward the political system, very neoliberal system that kind of prioritise growth, prioritise the markets, and everything else can flow from that. We're getting a bit radical, but stay with me. But the reason for that, I don't say that because I think we burn down the whole neoliberal system. I say that because the conditions that have been created on the back of all these years of austerity, of hyper inequality, provide the exact sort of tinderbox where far-right support can grow. Net zero on its own is not driving massive social inequalities, but it can chip into social and economic inequalities. There's a huge opportunity to redress those if we get this right. But if we're not proactive about doing it, I think the weaponisation becomes all the more potent, and it spills out beyond just those core far-right voters into the wider public. As Jamie pointed to, there is some high-level public support for this, but it's shaky, and there are caveats to it, fairness being one of the key caveats there. So I think the way that we undercut it is to get proactive about justice in the transition, while appreciating that actually we do just need to fucking get on and do it.
You did say you're recording this, right?
I do swear.
Cornelia.
Maybe to bring both arguments a bit together now. So net zero is a buzzword, and it is highly political to start with, to say that. And it had always a political origin, and I'm talking in difference to climate change mitigation, right? We're not talking about that. It's net zero as such. And it has been used and being activated to present a certain ideology or convey a certain ideology that we can measure and offset and balance out our emissions globally just with enough science and technology, and while continuing to grow nonstop. And that is a certain ideology that needs to be critiqued, that needs to be questioned, that needs to be coming with justice questions, right? Who's winning, who's losing, what are the trade-offs? And asking those questions and being critical about the concept of net zero and what is behind it is very valid and necessary to constructively build climate change mitigation measurements for the future that are valuable, sustainable. Lies, misperceptions, and also fake news altogether, of course, obstruct this constructive feedback. It does go against it, it's destructive instead of anything. And so we have to counter that with information, openness, transparency, communication, being open to the worries and listening and understanding why people are feeling left out or not on board with net zero. What Fraser said, what are the issues that people face and how can we overcome those and bring them on board? And it's not like leaving no one behind in a sense of let's drag them along, but let's give them headway, let's make them part of the whole process, give them a stake in the future and decision making for it. So that's all I wanted to.
Great, thank you. And I think that takes us really nicely to the next question, particularly this kind of question about fairness and about diversity of experiences. So a shared journey that we all kind of have to be on board with, but how we engage with it and how it affects us can vary according to a range of factors, right? And that's what makes it so volatile to be abused by people with vested interest who wants to use these narratives for their own particular ends. So in this kind of context of the diversity of experiences, distributions of cost and benefits of what lies ahead and what is already happening in fairness, Claire, I would like you to pose your question.
Thanks for joining us, guys. And my question is, with the UK's Just Transition Plan still lacking policy coherence across the both administrations, how can energy policy better integrate place-based strategies that address the distinct needs of post-industrial regions like the northeast of England and the central belt of Scotland? What are the risks of a one-size-fits-all net zero approach, and how might more devolved or community-led policy can help mitigate these risks?
Thank you. Who would like to start? Fraser.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think there's more and more work happening in this space just now, and a greater understanding that you cannot do this all centrally. The transition, in whatever form it takes, whether you're thinking about the transition in people's homes through the industrial transition, isn't going to look the same in Aberdeen as Aberystwyth, right? It's not going to look the same in Orkney and Oxford. It has to be different because people have different needs, experiences. They use energy in different ways. Their houses are all different. The industries they rely on are all different. Their ambitions for their own communities are all different as well. So I think from it, you can think about that even like really simply and technically. You cannot make a new, very variable, diverse energy system work if you're not reflecting the different ways in which people use their energy system. That's not to say it has to be all localized. You still need the big system to keep the lights on, to balance, to make sure everyone has what they need when they need it. But in terms of this transition, which is not just about the infrastructure, like we said before, it's about how you use energy, whether in your home, your community, town, your city, that's all different as well. So it has to be, to an extent, localised. And there have been developments towards doing that. So Jamie talked about NESO before, the National Energy System Operator. They've just introduced a new function, Regional Energy Strategic Planning, which breaks down the UK into 13 different regions with governance, a sort of governance body, a board of different stakeholders from those regions who come together and they try and set the strategic direction for the energy transition. At least it broadens out into other net zero stuff, but focused on energy. What that does is it allows you more localised, or regional in this case, input into how the transition actually then plays out. They have no obligation to a just transition, although they do have a principle to be fair, whatever the fuck that means, but they have no obligation to that. But the benefit of it is that it is a little bit more localised. Another trend that we're seeing within this, and something that I think is really exciting, is the trend of local authorities and increasingly communities taking not just ownership of their energy systems, but also that strategic planning function. Where do we actually need to heat pumps? Who do we expect to have them? What are the big areas of fuel poverty in our town or city, and what are the most appropriate solutions in those places? How do we engage? Because this is the other side of it, isn't it? Is that the more local you get, the more trusted, the more knowledgeable you are ultimately, or in theory at least, about the problems that you face and the people that are around you. The more connected you are, again, in theory, to those people, so that you can meaningfully, democratically engage with those people and set the trajectory. So localising a lot of this is important, notwithstanding the fact that you do have to have the big central government narrative and direction on it. Last point on the just transition question, the UK, for whatever reason, I think it's partly a narrative thing, have been reticent to commit to a just transition in the way that Scottish Government have and Welsh Government have and Northern Ireland are about to. They've been reticent to do that, I think, because justice sounds a bit leafy and lefty and sounds maybe a bit like an overcommitment for them. They don't want to spook the sort of the centre and the right voters that they won at the last election. But it is bleeding into some of their policies. So if you look at the likes of the Warm Homes Plan, they're building in fuel poverty components within that. If we think about things like NISO and the bigger strategic direction, they recognise that also community ownership of wind farms, solar farms, provides a huge amount of benefits and typically support justice on that more local scale in a way that big commercial developments don't. So there's recognition of it, not explicitly pulled out in the policies, but I think it's a more hopeful picture than it has been before, but still certainly work to do to get serious about it.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Cornelia?
Yeah, again. Yeah, so I'm a huge defender of local approaches to net zero just transition. I believe there's a pluriverse of transitions possible. It is not just one way that is the way everybody has to take. And here I'll use a term, pluriverse of transition, by colleagues Carlos Tornell and Alexander Dunlap. But it is, in my research, very prominent that communities have the knowledge, local knowledge, but also wider understandings of what's going wrong and what needs to change, but often lack the power, the capacities to bring about this change. And it's very hard for them to make their voices heard and being recognized on a more wider level that would allow them to do what they need to do. And I think we looked a bit at local grid infrastructure and what opportunities there are if there would be just national leeway, legal leeway, economic market leeway. But apart from that, I think on the whole wider level, the UK is extremely centralized, and that is one of its problems. Leslie Riddoch pointed out in her book a while back that in the Western European context and comparison, UK has extremely large local governments, like governance level. The smallest unit nowadays in the UK is councils, municipalities, and the average or median size of a council in the UK is above 100,000 people on around 1,000 square kilometers. In France, as comparison, there are 380 people on 11 square kilometers. In Belgium, which is one of the largest council areas in the European Union, 11,000 people, comparison to 100,000, right, on 40 square kilometers. Just think about 5, right? We have a small council relatively in the Scottish context, but it's St Andrews in there, Cooper, post-mining towns like Methil, Dunfermline, all the rural regions in between, and all is managed by one council. And it's like so many divergent and multiple interests just in this little bit, right? The biggest council is Highland Council. It's 1/3 of Scotland. It's nearly as big as Belgium in itself. And they manage the Inner Hebrides, the Highlands, Inverness, like huge range of territory. And there's no surprise to me that islanders that I interviewed said, doesn't matter if a decision is made in Westminster, in Holyrood, or in Inverness. It's far away, far detached, alienated from everything what we experience on a daily basis. You know, it has nothing to do with their reality. They don't feel there's any connection. They can't raise their voices. And on a community level, they do everything they can. They put trust together. They have development strategies and net zero plans. Island Center for Net Zero has done great work to show what is possible if islanders are allowed to do what they want to do. But there's just not the level of cooperation and acknowledgement in a governance level. And I think that needs to change, not just energy-wise.
I should add something. There's so many aspects to this. It's difficult to cover everything. I mean, I think the first thing that's worth saying, and this comes from a discussion we had in the UK Energy Research Centre about a planned debate about the balance of merits between just transition and net zero. The bottom line is it's a just transition. You need to have the transition before you can work forward. You can get to the issues about it being just. And so we need to hope that our question 1 issues are resolved and really continue to move in the right direction for the transition. And then you need to worry about how to make sure that it's just. And that's really hard. Kirsten Jenkins, has she engaged with the NC at all? Have you come?
Which was the former PEPtalk.
Okay, I see. She controversially likes to say on occasion there's no such thing as a just transition. That's the core of her research area, and she likes to throw that one out there. But what she's really getting at there is that it's really, really hard to measure all the dimensions of just and make sure that all boats are rising with the tide. And so, and I think it's an underestimated challenge. And I think that maybe it's easier to put in the title of Scotland's energy strategy than it is to action. And maybe some kind of government plans are naive in how much work it takes to get all this stuff right. And some of the things Fraser was saying for the last question hold true there. The kind of national to local scale question is also challenging because you need to have coordination at all of those scales. Some of these decisions just are not solely with the local authority, and there is a real challenge about the increasing number of things that local authorities are expected to do in this space. Fraser, I think you mentioned the rest, the regional energy strategic plans, but there's also the local heat planning that comes under local authorities, a bunch of other strategic plans that have got a wonderful array of different acronyms that are difficult to keep on top of, but are all really challenging and all speak to very specific expertise that local authorities didn't necessarily have, in previous iterations. So there's a huge challenge on local authorities to develop the expertise and the capability to develop coherent regional planning, and so that's a massive challenge. And it's also a challenge to have that coordination down through national, devolved, and local governance. And there's lots of examples of where we've done really bad jobs of that in other areas. So there's a huge task there, and that all sounds very negative, but that's not. I think that it's a thing that we absolutely must strive for, and there's the two sides to why we need to pursue it. Finish with this, and one is that it's the right thing to do. Morally, it's the thing that we should all be able to sit behind. But there's another selfish side to that, which is that the transition is less likely to happen if we develop public attitudes barriers to that transition because of the injustices that might evolve if they're not dealt with in the way that Fraser suggested. We need, there's a sense with which lots of things in the net zero space might have an inherent regressive nature to them because they involve things that are more expensive than the thing that we ought to do already. And that necessarily can exclude some social demographics if it's not dealt with in a kind of complementary policy type of way, which speaks to another huge challenge. We don't need to, it's not just coordinating across policy scales from national right down to local, but it's also coordinating across policy suites. And those policy levers don't all sit within one department necessarily. And so there's a massive coordination problem that we're probably not great at and that we need to get good at very quickly if we are to have a successful just transition, possible or not.
Thank you very much. And I think we're starting to see here and unpacking this kind of multifaceted picture that characterizes policy space. And we started talking about the different levels and scales of policy interventions from local through kind of a regional devolved to national. But of course, that kind of scaling up doesn't end well. This is an international global undertaking that we're talking about here, which leads us very nicely to our next question, which is going to be posed by Vivian.
Hi, thank you for your insights today. My question is more directed at global coordination. So I was wondering that directing investments into emerging markets and developing economies is key to achieving a just energy transition. But these economies continue to face the largest global financing gap. So I was wondering how you envision the role for UK energy policy in trying to bridge this gap and what mechanisms might be most effective in mobilizing required investment.
So the questions of scales, the questions of fairness, the questions of collaboration, all in there. Who would like to start?
Me?
Cornelia.
I would start quite radical and suggest that we need to take serious the principle of the polluters pay and ask the big companies who have, through history, profited from cheap nature, cheap labor, cheap energy across the globe, exploited our resources, and made huge profits to pay back, and to actually now invest into nature recovery, into low emission and low carbon industry and technologies without asking for profits back. It is not up to farmers who have lived next to a mine to clean it up. It is up to the company who has taken out the resources and made profits and sold high profits, that's minerals. And I also don't think that the nation states in itself necessarily, but in parts also are the ones that need to take to the cashier and need to pay. But it requires large global collaboration on level and frameworks, legal frameworks that would actually enforce such measurements and say, you pumped oil out of the North Sea, to give an example, for 3 decades. You don't own the platform anymore, and I'm referring to the latest blog post on our Center for Energy Ethics blog. You still need to clean it up, though, even though you've sold it on. And not just to say, they don't own it anymore, so they can't be held accountable for the mess they created. So I think that is a principle that the polluters pay principle is not new. It's there, but it has not been taken serious. It has not been enforced. And I think that is the starting point to seriously address.
And a really nice question as well, whether, nation states are still the kind of the core policy making and governance units, or do we need to broaden this thinking about, is it up to nation states, or is that the different industry sectors where some of those actions and policy needs to be created? I thought
Fraser, Jamie. Yeah, please.
Yeah. This was the question that made me most nervous when I was reading the ones that were sent through before. Well, because I feel most cynical about this process just now. However many COPs we've done now, the climate change conferences, however many of those, everyone has some commitment to however many billions each government from wealthier nations is going to send in climate finance to the nations that are most affected. And we so rarely get anywhere near spending the money that is promised and set out in these agreements. And I think there are a few reasons for it. And part of the reason I'm nervous about it is because what we have now, led by the likes of Trump and Musk, is an increase in sort of nativism in politics, where people are going, right, let's worry about ourselves, let's bring manufacturing home, let's build lots of new factories, let's use US goods or UK goods or whatever it might be. And I worry that this trend of insularity makes that job even harder, of getting the money to the most affected people in places, one, to mitigate against the worst impacts, but then to develop economies on the back of solutions, because everyone's going to have to at some point in time. So I'm nervous about that. I don't think I have a clear answer for it. But one of the reasons that I think we fall over on this so often is this idea of growth, is this idea that Washington or the International Monetary Fund dictate that you must have a democracy and you must have a liberalised market economy to get anything done, and then we'll give you some money to do that, and then we'll loosen up the purse strings a little bit. What that does, and again I'm going off on a radical tangent, but I'm in the zone. What that does is it then creates this policy landscape of that which is not profitable is not possible. And I don't think we can be thinking about the problem of climate change, or we shouldn't be at least, as something that needs to be profitable. It needs to be fixed of its own accord, right? And growth, return on investment is fucking meaningless on a planet that is not fit to survive. And I think that underpins, to bring it back, I think that underpins part of the reason why we fall down so often on international climate finance. I think that's been part of the challenge. Now, lots of work is happening, lots of good stuff is happening. We have, not to abuse the term, but we have just transition partnerships internationally now that are designed specifically for this, not just for sharing of finance, but also sharing of expertise, of technologies, trying to open up new places into new markets. But how successful they've been, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. Again, I think that core challenge remains, that a lot of people have caused a lot of damage here. And I'm not convinced that simply inviting more countries into the same markets, which have allowed that damage to happen, is the way that's going to get us there. That's a really depressing answer, I apologise. But also the polluter pays principle is correct. You mentioned, sorry, something was just sparked in, you mentioned on the should it be government should we widen this? I don't think you can implement something like polluter pays without governments taking the initiative on that. Because markets will operate, and this isn't a criticism of markets, but market companies, corporations will operate within the rules that are set. This is a very basic premise of political economy, of institutions. Governments set the rules, and whatever loopholes there are, that's markets will find ways to exploit them. Again, that's not a critique. You get away with what you can if your focus is making profit and making the bottom line. So without governments, I think, taking the initiative, taking leadership and collaborating on that, breaking this kind of the current trend and mindset towards it's all about us, tariffs, nativism, I think we're going to find that really, really difficult. I'm sorry, it's not optimistic.
Thank you, Jamie.
I'm not going to add to the optimism, I'm afraid. This goes back to the points about the different lenses of what's just. And so, of course, there are lots of domestic justice issues that we've kind of more focused on in our comments so far. And if you add the international lens to that, it shows you how many different types of things you're trying to solve for in a world where there's probably right now, because of political headwinds, kind of decreasing resource for these kind of things. USA went away, increases in defence spending are likely to come at a cost of aid budgets. I think we're already seeing that in some in the UK and in other Western economies, and so it's really, really challenging. The other less optimistic point around this polluter pays approach is that whilst that makes moral sense, it's very difficult to organise a system that doesn't result in the costs ultimately being passed down to the consumer in one way or another. So if in the worst case for environmental bad, the government, so therefore ultimately the taxpayer, becomes the insurer of last resort. If the company folds, disappears, and is no longer existed, there isn't a legal structure to hold something that doesn't exist anymore accountable for the thing that it's done. And this has been the case for, historically for a bunch of energy things like nuclear waste, which has been a real big challenge in trying to hold accountable, the increasing costs that we recognise of the long-term management of nuclear waste, and that's not costed into the business models of any of the companies that own these things. So it is, you can imagine a world in which you can have a structure that holds polluters accountable and that reduces the impact on the consumer at the end, but it does involve some quite radical restructuring of how the world works. And it might, there is no international government. There's no, and they're very, and increasingly we test the power of international organisations and agreements in the current political world that we find ourselves in, and we find them wanting often at the moment. It seems increasingly hard to hold anyone accountable at an international level. And you can see that in conflict around the world. It's no longer enough to use and try to hold somebody accountable for war crimes that are internationally agreed. We don't find that very easy, it turns out. So imagine how difficult it would be to hold an international company to account, particularly when that company folds in whatever that means, goes bankrupt or ceases to exist, or doesn't have it, no longer is capitalized to be able to pay whatever it is that you ask of them in terms of. So it's really difficult it would involve significant restructuring of how things work. And people have written academic work about this. How would you, if you restructure around a different type of domestic product. So Bhutan famously has a domestic happiness metric, which the king insists upon over a gross domestic product type economic return model. And and you can theorize how you structure something that would work like that. The practicalities of getting it to work in reality seem really, really challenging. And in the meantime, we've got to solve climate change in the next couple of decades. So there might be a kind of pragmatism type approach to some of this challenge, so that we're expedient enough to still have a planet left to restructure in a better economic way in the future, which you can imagine may take quite a long time. I'm sorry that wasn't wrong.
I actually, before we move on to the next question, optimism. I do have an optimism. I have one, and it came from, I don't know if any of you saw it in The Guardian a couple of days ago on Earth Day, which is the global survey, 130,000 people around the world, about their attitudes towards climate, about action they'd be willing to take, etc. And one of the core, or a couple of the core findings that were really interesting. The first was that over 90%, in fact, no, 89%, that was the whole name of the movement, the 89 Project. 89% of people everywhere around the world see climate as a major issue. They think governments need to do more about it and would be willing to take some kind of action. And 89% of all people, wealthy, developing countries, from upper class, working class communities, right across the board, 89%. That's a huge amount of people. But within that, it was about 70% of people also agreed that their governments, particularly in wealthier countries, should be responsible and should hold true on their commitments to finance the reparation of the damages caused by climate and to support developing economies to work through those, so that they have their own economies built on the sort of cleaner industries of the future. That's reason to be optimistic, insofar as actually beyond energy, which we accepted in the UK as a shakier peg that we're on. But globally, climate is kind of not controversial anymore, certainly not in the way that it was. But even this, which could be seen as a little bit more radical, well, not necessarily radical, but radical in the current political frame of governments should be paying for international damages of climate change. That's positive, and that can be tapped into. It takes a movement to tap into that, and it takes, very brave politicians willing to stand up and say, you know what, actually, we should be holding true on these commitments. But there's appetite on the ground there, and I don't think we should underestimate that going forward.
Great, thank you. It's great to inject a little bit of optimism for the conversation. I think it's needed and valued at this stage. We touched on a number of themes in the last few minutes, but amongst them were issues of accountability and kind of imbalances and distributions in international context. And I think Rachel's question really nicely fits into that part of the conversation.
Sorry, it's a bit of a long one. Many of the technologies and infrastructure projects underpinning the UK's path to net zero, like solar and wind, which require critical metals and minerals, rely on extractive industries in parts of the world already devastated by climate change. So how can we, like here in the UK, claim a just transition while maybe indirectly inflicting environmental and social harm elsewhere? So is there an honest path forward that the UK can take that acknowledges and addresses this global imbalance, whether that's through certification schemes, verified supply chains, locally manufactured alternatives, or solar alternatives like perovskites, or something of that sort?
Thank you. Who would like to?
It's my turn, I think. and critical minerals is an area of important. I should just say that your question wasn't too long, and the quality of the questions is excellent. We're really, obviously, a very informed and engaged group. So well done for your part in creating that environment. This is another really hard one, and it's again another justice lens that just demonstrates how complicated this whole thing is, and probably how underthought it has been in its kind of in the just transitions, a kind of nascent stage. And I'm sure we're getting better at it, but there's definitely a lot of things that are not considered by all. When people say just transition, not everybody is talking about the same thing, and people have different ideas about what the justice that they're worried about when they say that. And this is one that's really easy to put in the background, right? You use your mobile phone and you're not thinking about the artisanal mining happening in some remote part of the rest of the world that's really detrimental to the health of those who work there, or and it doesn't provide a commensurate income to those who are engaged in it, and we take advantage of that low cost products that we use. And I use the mobile phone example because it's an easy one that people go to a lot. And there's been lots of proposals about how we might, and you mentioned some of them, certification schemes, or having a better understanding of what the supply chain actually is. You may have noticed in the media in the last couple of weeks that the Secretary of State for Business, Miliband, has been considering rewriting the bill for GB Energy to make it explicit that GB Energy is not allowed to invest in anything that uses, and I think specifically the things that we're worried about right now are slave labour. But so Fraser already mentioned this, at the UK level there's a reluctance to kind of codify a just transition, but it's clear that there's discussions happening, and that there's an effort to think about, okay, what large investments are the UK government making that might have an impact, and how can we write it into the rules that we minimise that impact. So it is being thought about, but there are so many aspects to that it's not going to be got right immediately. And we need to be prepared as largely an importer and consumer of these benefits that the negative impacts exist elsewhere, of paying more for stuff in the future if we want to address these things. Because the bottom line is these ills associated with supply chains, the reason that they're there is because it's the lowest cost way of getting stuff to the consumer, whether they're in the UK or elsewhere. And any move that you can think of that would improve the justice of the end worker at the end of that supply chain is likely to have a cost to the end consumer. And that's part of the reason why governments are struggling to wrestle with this, because that immediately becomes a very difficult voter proposition, right? Stand behind a policy that is really easy to put over to one side because it doesn't happen. You don't have to look every day at the impact that you're having at the end of your supply chain, but also say to the consumer, or to the voter, that things are going to be more expensive because we're fixing this thing that you can't see. That you make, people who are not everybody is as engaged as this room in terms of these issues, and a lot of people will find it very easy to put those types of justice issues away to the back. So that's going to be one of the trickiest justice issues to deal with. But there, as you pointed out, there are some ways forward. Trying to create some market cost for the externality, right? So if you can't say that you have provenance of where the resource came from, where the critical material came from, and how it was produced, then either it's, we're doing this with what's it called again? Importing fuels. What's the acronym? Well, it will come to me. But we're writing in Europe and the UK. There's increasing rules about energy and the provenance of the carbon that it's carrying with it as it crosses the trading boundary. CBAMs, exactly. And you could do the same with the justice issues around any supply chain. And for energy, there's lots of them, right? Because we use a lot of lithium in batteries. We use a lot of neodymium in magnets of permanent magnet motors in large generators and wind turbines. We use lots of very weird things and lots of photovoltaics like indium, tellurium, cadmium, and we could have systems in place to make sure that the provenance of all of those supply chains is well understood, and that the final manufacturer of the unit that gets sold to the consumer, could be forced to have some kind of certification there that all of the supply chains are understood and that the impacts to everybody who's involved in that supply chain is accounted for. But that's going to be one of the trickiest ones for us to deal with in this just transition lens problem.
I think much of what I said the former question applies also here, polluter pay. But what I want to add are two things I think or highlight is one, the importance of circular economy and not. Of course, we don't have all the minerals we need for possibly or all the resources we need within localities or regions, but I think trying to get capacities and skills and as much out of what you have yourself is good. Is something a way to go. Just there's so many turbines already in operation in Scotland. And at one point they will reach the end of life. How can we refurbish them, reuse them, recycle them? How can we, all the solar panels on the roofs, they are really tricky to recycle and take apart, and they end up on large landfills. How can we look at this end of life and say, we can make use of it in certain ways and try to push innovation in that regard? What do we already have? Or what can we make out of this? And Scotland is very ambitious now with trying to get skills, just transition skills and capacities going and try to retain jobs and benefits of the industry within the country, which I think is positive in itself and not just in the energy sector, but in total. Part of it is also then global collaboration and fair terms of exchange and trade. And there, what Fraser says also, we need governments and international government collaboration to foster these environments, to push industries who rely on mining and resources extractions to really be transparent about the processes, to really show and improve their supply chains, and that we actually get an idea where what product is coming from. Those two things.
I think that where things are coming from, for me is point one. When we did Glasgow Community Energy, which was solar panels owned by the community on 2 big schools in areas of high deprivation of Glasgow, we generate power, sell it to the grids, money goes back to the community. Perfect, beautiful, love it. We tried our damnedest to track down where each supplier was suggesting they supply their solar panels from. None of them could tell us with any certainty. None of them could trace it back to a single source of origin. They could tell us which different component parts, particularly any that were manufactured in Europe, which was not most of them. They could tell us where they came from, but they couldn't tell us the direct origin of most of the other key components of solar PV. You can also, I don't know if you've ever checked, but on AliExpress, you can buy a solar panel that'll do your phone, your kettle, and your TV for about 20 quid. A single solar panel. And I don't necessarily trust for that type of technology that that's coming from a particularly good, healthy, human rightsy type of place. So I think that understanding across the supply chain, within the market as well as from government, probably led by government, understanding where all this stuff comes from is point number one. There's a wider thing here. I like the point about circular economy, because there's a wider question here that it's not just renewable technology, right? When we started drilling for oil and gas, same practices apply. When we currently, clothes fashion is a huge thing, which has had a somewhat meaningful campaign behind it against sort of fast fashion and where you're getting your clothes from, trying to make better choices, trying to make it more convenient to make those better choices. I think we're at the point now where maybe it's not a campaign, maybe it's something distinctly more serious needs to happen with renewables as well, because if we're going to pitch this, not just on justice, again, it's a thing that we come back to, and it's a little bit ethereal in terms of what it actually means. But on that basic premise of renewables are supposed to be the sort of the clean future for everyone, powering us all through climate change and redressing some of those issues. And I think this is a massive, massive sort of skeleton in the closet, for want of a better phrase, of renewables just now that nobody wants to talk to, partly because as well supply chains are massively oversubscribed already. So all these supply chains that we're using that invariably stem from massive human rights violations are oversubscribed. We can't get the stuff that we need in some places to build offshore wind farms for 15, 20 years in some places. So the argument then comes back is, well, if we do all this, it's going to slow us down. But if we don't do it, what are we actually fueling here? What are we actually achieving with all of this? We might be able to decarbonise and provide everyone with slightly lower cost electricity, but at what far wider moral cost, human cost, health cost, planetary cost, depending on the practices that are being used in these places. So we cannot separate them at all. But on a micro scale, I guess, or personally, anecdotally, understanding where stuff comes from in the supply chain is point number one, because right now we really don't.
Can I just go? I mean, I don't know how we'll get
very quick.
Yeah. I just want to pour a little bit of cold water on the circular economy bit, because while that's something we should absolutely be doing, again, it's not just a sensible thing for a number of different reasons, technically, but it's a moral thing that we can feel comfortable about. But while we're in this, we don't have a blackboard I can write on here, do we? While we're in this really steep growth phase of renewable technologies, so we have to install a whole bunch of stuff in order to meet our climate change targets. That means that, imagine two S-curves drawn on a chart. One S-curve is the amount of in-use material for time along the x-axis, and one graph is the in-use material that's in products. Let's just, for sake of argument, think about electric vehicles, and we're only interested in lithium. You've got a curve for the amount of lithium that's driving around in electric cars in the world. And the second S-curve is time shifted to the right by the amount of time that a vehicle is in life. And end-of-life products are the ones that you're recycling. So you've got two S-curves, and the steep part of the curve is like this, and that's where we are now. We're in the kind of, we need to get gazillions of electric vehicles on the road as fast as we can, and we're kind of behind on the curve. And draw a straight line between this curve here and this curve here. So this curve here is essentially the amount that you need for the next year's growth in electric vehicles. And this curve here at the bottom is the amount of material that's coming out of the end-of-life products. It's based on the amount that you installed 10, 15 years ago. So we're going to go through a phase where we really need lots and lots of virgin primary material. And the only way to address that is to degrowth, to dramatically reduce the amount that we want to move around, the amount of electricity that we need. Not a lot of those solutions look hugely practical, but they can be done, and you would probably, depending on how you measure standard of living, it would probably mean that people got to move around less or be there. So if we want to do this growth thing that we're trying to do to meet net zero, we're going to rely on mining stuff for quite a long time into the future. And so that's the bit that we really need to get right. And that's going to be tough, but there are ways to do it. And in the meantime, we can develop the expertise to make that economy as circular as possible. So that by the time we get up to the plateau phase, it's much easier to deal with these mining challenges because we're doing a load less mining. And we don't need nearly as much primary material. But we need to get through this growth phase somehow and causing the least damage possible.
Great, thank you very much. And again, some added layers of complexity to the conversations that come up here, including some of the contradictions. There is something that is fair or something that is cheap, or are we doing things in consideration of just as a process, or are we prioritizing the timescales and the urgency of the task? And I think that leads us really nicely to the last questions from the students from today, which comes from Lara.
Yeah. Hi. So clearly the energy transition has been a key topic both in this discussion and our module overall, particularly in regard to the just transition. And my question is about the role that public participation plays as a tool for the just or justice part of this tradition, ensuring that it's a fair process as best possible. And particularly, how do you go about ensuring that the right people and communities are engaged with? And how do you get them to continue to participate without it leading to issues like participation fatigue in order to achieve a just transition whilst also making sure that it's still a timeliest transition?
Thank you.
Really, you must come up against this. Because the kinds of communities that you're looking at get tapped up all the time for participation.
Yeah. So we talked about it in classes around it. But yeah, so the whole fatigue behind participation is not caused by too much participation as such. It's too much engagement events without real impact, without any true meaning for people. They go there, they get information, they don't feel they are listened to, they don't see that it changes anything, and then they're just overloaded with these events, and that are kind of also used by developers to, how do you say, legitimize that process. Yeah, we have consulted. They're all fine, but they were not. So it is a matter of what is actually the whole objective of this outreach events. Can we call it participation? What is actual participation? And if people would have a stake in decision making, how different would things look like? And so that is my first thought about that question, to really see where is the fatigue coming from, what is behind it, and reemphasize that local decision making and local knowledge is very important and is often overlooked when it comes to, we need the just transition fast, now, large. And a bit what you say about we need this growth now, which I would always a bit question and say, how just and transition can it be if we do it just very fast and very large scale? So to break it down again to again, focus on what people actually need in place. What do they envision as a future can lead us to much more transition and much more justice than trying to get businesses on board on a national level to build the largest pylons and produce the most EV. In my opinion.
I think we're going to have a perfect spectrum on this, because I know what I'm going to say. So start at the top. I don't think the idea of fairness, justice, whatever, slows us down at all. I don't think it needs to. I think there are fucking thousands of people that have been working in this space for so long, directly on energy, but also indirectly on wider social justice issues, that understand these processes. One of the seminal pieces on sort of public participation in innovation, in energy and stuff like that, I just referenced in a report a few weeks ago, is from 1979. Still referenced in just about everything since. We understand these things. We've been doing it for a long time, and around energy, there are community-based organisations, academic organisations, lots of people that know where the pitfalls are, where the mines are within the field. They understand the challenges, and many of them have been working to implement the solutions, just on a very small scale, because we haven't necessarily given it the same value as figuring out the technical stuff, the big scale stuff. That's not a critique. We have to figure all of that out. We can't do it all without doing it all. It sounds very stupid to say. But I don't think justice needs to be slow. I do think meaningful engagement and participation takes a bit more time. But I don't think we get there without doing that. Because as we set out in the top question, you start to piss people off, and then it's not just Nigel fucking Farage and everyone else that's annoyed at you. It's everyone who go, well, why the fuck should I spend 10 grand on a heat pump? You guys haven't given a shit about what we had to say about any of this. Actually, this doesn't work for my house, doesn't work for my family, for the way that we live. For the grids, yeah. So I think that it's important to recognise, I suppose, that the idea of justice, and again, I'm getting sick of that word, it's in my fucking job title, I'm sick of that word. This idea of justice in and of itself doesn't have to be slow. It's going to take a little bit more time. I don't think we can go all the way to doing it without getting those sort of principles, practices and processes in at the ground floor of everything else that we're trying to do. We've learned the lessons, we have the lessons, plenty of people know about it. On the participation side, I think the fatigue point is really interesting. I think there's also, energy is interesting in terms of where power lies in the energy system, energy policy, energy decision making. It lies partly with government, policymakers, obviously. It lies partly with the markets. We said before, sort of profitability and possibility are very much joined up together because we don't need, but developers need to turn a profit to. They need to have a viable business case before they can build a big offshore wind farm. So they hold a bit of power within this transition as well. But then it's the technocrats and the experts. And I don't say that in a sort of belligerent, derogatory way, but it's a very expert, very complex transition. So they hold all the power, and we get to engage and participate within that at their gift, broadly speaking. And I don't think that the people on that side of things who do the deep energy systems, the modelling, the engineering side of it, even the policy and market side, I don't think they're bastards. I don't think they're people who want to exclude everyone. I just think they haven't been doing the stuff that in the social sciences, that in academia more broadly, that in communities, that those groups are really experienced in. So we assume that the knowledge and expertise doesn't exist, but actually, the better we smash them together, the better the participation ends up being, the further, the faster we all get to go. But I think that point around sort of the experts holding power is a really important one, because if we're just, as Cornelia says, if we just engage to tick the box to legitimise what we kind of want to do anyway, that's a massive recipe for people getting very pissed off at you. Well, actually, we had this deliberative session. It was created at a citizens' assembly, and then Scottish Government just fucked it off and did whatever they were planning to do in the first place. There has to be a tangible line of accountability and a tangible line of action to make it worthwhile. Last point, and I will give way, on the participation side of things, that power dynamic, I suppose, at the gift of developers, at the gift of policymakers, at the gift of experts, but in terms of the knowledge that you then receive, it's not just about action, it's about how we value that knowledge, because people in communities know about their communities in a way that some policymaker in Whitehall doesn't.
You said you wouldn't apologise.
I think so. It was more about the offence rather than the language. But it's impossible, as we mentioned before with the Highlands example, for someone in Edinburgh even to know what's really going on in St Andrews or Forfar, where I'm from, right? They don't have to, realistically. So in terms of what we value as knowledge, as participation in that transition. It's not enough to say, right, we'll come out, we'll talk to you for a little bit and do what we then want to go and do. We have to sort of shift the mindset, and I appreciate that's fluffy, but shift that mindset of, as long as we talk to people, we'll be fine, but actually sort of providing a space where people can directly influence and have a stake in the decision-making process is much more meaningful, and I think the track that we need to be on, lest we end up just annoying everyone in the process. Thank you. Not when I started.
Excellent. Well, and can I just go back to your question for a second? Was the essence about how do we keep the right types of people engaged in the process, or the informed?
Yeah, how do you make sure that all the people that need to be involved in order to make sure that it is fair, so to speak, are involved and they're not being left out.
And so I think that something to add here is that it's everybody, right? Because I think it's really hard to say that there's a set of people that need to be involved in and that's where actually the challenge will come, because it's likely that the people who are keen and informed and want to be involved are, you win them over. You still hit the buffers politically if you're not bringing everyone along, it's those who are engaged and informed are probably a small proportion of the population, and most people just want to go about their lives and worry about the things that they're interested in, and it's not net zero and just transition for everyone. So you do need to find a way to bring everyone along for the ride. And we can argue about what the right technical solution is, and we can argue about policies, but there are routes through those things, and public opposition is likely to be the last and hardest to overcome barrier, if there is a barrier that slows us down, to the extent that we're struggling to get our commitment. So that's why this is important. The selfish part of, if you're interested in the net zero transition, about the just transition and bringing people along for the ride, is that if you don't do that, it dramatically, in my opinion, reduces the likelihood that you can get these really challenging things done. And so, yeah, it's everyone, and we need to bring them all along for the ride.
Sorry, I know we're running out of time. I actually missed the second bit, the how, which I think is a really interesting question. I know you touched on it, Cornelia. I think there's a need to understand that as we talked about with the national and the local thing, there's no one size fits all. It starts with, I'm going to say something that's really wanky and it's a platitude, but you have to meet people where they are first and foremost on their conditions at a time of day that suits them. I do a lot of engagement with people experiencing fuel poverty. I sort of, most of my free time, what little free time I get, is spent in working class communities like the one that I come from, having these conversations about these different issues. And there are very, very simple lessons that you learn through that process in terms of how to engage to make sure that you can capture as many different people as possible. That first one, meet people where they are on their terms, rather than going in with, here, we want to build a massive wind farm, or we're going to build 20 pylons along the horizon of your community. Is that okay? Cool. Can we give you 10 grand a year to make that okay? No. What do you mean? What do you mean you're annoyed at us? I never saw that coming. So this idea of the different techniques that we use, but also very, very simple, instrumental, hold meetings at a time that suits most people in their community. Go beyond your simple town hall style meetings or community centre meetings, unless that's something that's a logical meeting point. And try and reach out to people directly to make sure that you're bringing them in, that you're incentivising that. And very often, sorry to say, paying people for their giving up their time to help you design your policy or project. I think there's some simple, really simple stuff there. And climbing, I've gone off on one. Climbing down from the technical side of things as well. The language of this conversation is a nightmare, as you'll have heard on this panel today. Simplifying that as much as possible without being patronising, meeting people where they are, and making sure that you're incentivising that with action on the back of it, I think is trifecta.
Two sentences.
Okay, 2 sentences.
So right now we're going through a process of codifying best practice and community benefit, and there's been a whole bunch of positive and negative stories about what communities have got out of big developments, but that's something that is being wrestled with properly now, and there are really excellent organisations that are kind of helping push that forward. So the community benefit space is going to change a lot in the next few years, and that's a really important how getting communities to engage in what's going on, and yeah, that's a point where the conversation can be had.
Great, thank you very much. And I like it how through those questions we started this kind of questioning, big themes and then big concepts to ending up those kind of practicalities. Okay, but how would we go about it, and what are some of the things that we can or should be doing? So thank you very much for those excellent questions. We have about 10 minutes to take some other questions from the room. In the interest of time and to make sure we can address as many of them as possible, I will ask the panelists to be relatively brief in their responses and maybe having one person responding to a question. So raise your hand if you feel it's particularly pertinent to you, 2 hands if you're incredibly eager to answer that one. Paul.
Can you repeat the questions?
I will do my best. I think we might have some questions online as well as in the room, so we're going to take a room online and alter it that way. And Roxandra, let's start with you.
And thank you for being here and sharing your expert insight with us. I've got 2 very short questions based on.
Can you pick one, please?
Right. So it was mentioned when discussing variable minerals, the need to create a market for externalities. That, as far as I understand it, involves looking long term. How do you see that being put into action when a lot of policies and instruments exist during or are dictated by political life cycles?
Excellent question. Jamie, I wonder if it might be one for you.
I mean, the political life cycles thing is something that applies to all of this stuff, right? It also impacts climate change. But I think we've proved that we can surmount political life cycles because we have global targets and we have national targets, and we've yet to test whether they can be legally enforced, right? So that's, I guess, the one big caveat. But I don't see any reason why we couldn't have some kind of CBAM for all types of supply chains, including critical mineral supply chains, and you could create a market benefit of being able to prove your supply chain that could be monetized. It will take political capital to do it. It will be hard, like all these things are. But I think there are examples of having been able to do exactly that for other things. So I'm optimistic there. A lot of optimism.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question. Yes, Amy.
I guess we all know about wind energy, solar energy, ground source heat pumps and things, but my question is quite brief. Are there any emerging trends or technologies that are not really in the public eye that you think could be quite interesting and kind of shape energy policy over the next sort of decades?
Excellent. Let me just repeat that for the microphone about emerging trends and technologies that might shape that landscape, which actually really nicely aligns with the second part of the title for today. What is on the horizon? What is ahead? So thank you very much for taking us forward in that sense, Amy. Who would like to?
Do you want to go? Only one of us gets things.
Yeah, I think what is done a lot now is battery and storage facilities, and that make sure that the renewable energy that we get at one point is not lost because it's too much at more than we need at a certain moment. And I would refer to Martin Smith and hydrogen and the battery facilities at the university who do a lot of amazing research on how can we make batteries more cheap and also less reliant on rare minerals in faraway countries. So I think there's a lot of potential there to actually look at those technologies and develop more there.
Can I just add quickly?
I think with this question you all get a turn, because I think it's going to be interesting to hear what the different views from the panel are in terms of what's coming. So Fraser.
Yeah, I'll there's a couple in mind, but I'll pick one. But I'll tell you what the second one was. The second one was heat networks. But the one that I'll focus on for this response is AI and automation, as it pertains to us in our homes specifically. So things like flexible tariffs, time of use tariffs, aren't brand new. Maybe throughout a day, in the afternoon it's really cheap to use electricity, or overnight it's really cheap to use your electricity. But at peak times, when you're having your dinner or having your breakfast, it's really expensive. The idea is that it encourages you to turn up or turn down at certain times of the day, helps balance the system, helps you save some money. Increasingly, tariffs are emerging, not yet at scale in the UK, but they are in other markets, which effectively automate that process. They'll embed with your heat pump, with your electric vehicle, with solar PV and a battery if you've got it in your house already. and essentially make the call on your behalf to capitalise on cheaper costs within reason. There's a big potential fairness issue here in terms of whose data is used, where does that data go, what is it then repurposed for, what control do you have over your house, particularly if you're someone from a more vulnerable background who is less engaged with that type of technology. But it is something, it's a trend, and it's likely to be a very prominent one once we all get to the point of most of us having those new heating technologies and stuff in the home.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so the obviously paper previously around innovation timelines and how long it takes to get something from a lab bench into consumers' homes. And a blog was written around that by Director of the Energy Research Centre, Rob Gross, which was called "Why We Shouldn't Believe in Fairies." The point of that is a lot of the stuff we've just been talking about just now might not be regularly in the public discourse, but it's well-known technology that's been around for a while. It's really, really problematic if we want to, as some economists have suggested in the past, roll back now on progress because we hope that there's a new technology coming that's going to make it much easier in the future. We're on such tight timescales now that we don't have enough time to invent something completely blue sky that will actually deliver on the kind of timescales that we need to deliver. So it's this kind of incremental innovation, right? Making the things that we already know about better, more efficient heat pumps, a more efficient way to engage with your energy use through tariffs. That might be smart tariffs, but it could also be social tariffs. There's a lot of innovation in social tariff stuff, and fairness through people paying different amounts depending on what you're trying to solve for. So yeah, don't believe in fairies. I would say we need to try and do as much as we can with the things that we already know about, because it takes a long time to get new things from a lab bench into the consumer market.
Thank you very much. Yes, Paul.
So we have one question from our online audience. I'm going to move to the link for example. So, according to Statistica, UK annual primary energy demand in 2025 is predicted to be a total of 129 MTOE, which is about 2,000 trillion. Which is 2081.77 terawatt hours, of which total electricity demand will be about 20%, with balance mainly from fossil fuels of 75%. So how will the UK convert the import of around 1,500 terawatt hours of fossil fuels to zero fossil energy in 25 years?
Easy.
Just the net and net zero means that we don't need to get to absolute zero as long as we're doing something else to, so there might be some really, really sticky parts of the economy where fossil fuels are still important. And actually most of the UN scenarios, the assessment report 6, I think we're at now, scenarios that get to net zero have some fossil fuels in them, so that we don't need to get to absolute zero. But it is really, really challenging, and we need to do lots and lots with renewable electricity, lots and lots with other vectors like hydrogen, as long as we can make sure that they're zero or very, very low. Or in fact, hydrogen can also be negative emissions embodied. So it's a huge, huge challenge, and it just involves everything that we know about and using it as to its fullest extent.
Right.
And dealing with the demand side, excuse me. So there's lots we could do to use less. Some of these tariffs that Fraser's just been talking about are a part of that, but there's lots that we can do to make things more efficient and use less energy per activity.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just going to see if there's any other question from the room before we go to another one online. Yes.
Thank you so much for coming here and sharing your expertise. So my question is energy, space is not only affected by the policy, but it's very powerful in terms all aspects of our life and persons individually in the energy. So we can affect policy, affect the way the systems work and everything. Is there any certain ways how energy space actually can affect the political systems, political talks we are living in, from within, instead of being affected? For example, the problems of energy are a lot of the problems of capitalistic societies and systems. So basically, while we are trying to do the transitions, all these issues are actually being exacerbated. We just play on like very small scale for like little community. It's still unfair for like people in Bolivia, like buying the iridium, for example. So like, is there any way we can use this urgency of transition to affect like some activism or something like a communal goal to affect using energy to affect the way the world like
Okay, there's 2 hands up, which means Fraser is very eager to answer that question. Please go for it.
Yeah, that's.
Shall we repeat online?
So the question is about how the policy shapes the energy landscapes, but in what ways does the energy landscape shape the policy, and what this kind of cycle can look like? That's my understanding of that question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a good question. And you used the C words, which is my favourite, use capitalism as well. I absolutely, there are ways we can start to redress that rather than being sort of passive recipients of what's happening in energy policy, and instead sort of, if I can use a horrible phrase, sort of take power back in some ways. Lots of different ways. So activism naturally is an obvious one. There are huge movements built around climate justice, energy justice that have gained a ton of momentum. And we mentioned earlier that actually broad public is on side with a lot of this stuff. But I think more tangibly, in terms of how you can start to reclaim some of that power from the system. And again, this isn't meant to be people who work in energy are bastards. A lot very, very well-meaning, trying to do what they can within the confines of a very capitalist, very growth, profit-focused economic system. I'm not convinced that justice and delivering the transition at scale, at pace, is necessarily compatible with that traditional model of economics. It's going to have to happen within it to some degree. But the idea of justice that we talk about, I'm not fully convinced it gets us all the way there. I think there will always be losers, and there will be the people who lose out as a result of accelerating inequalities, and have done for since the 80s, broadly speaking. But in terms of what you can actually do, my favourite example, my favourite thing to talk about is community-owned energy. The reason that I think that's not just about there's a misperception about community energy that if you've got a retired engineer who lives close to you, an activist, maybe an artist, whoever, who have a little bit of time on their hands, they can help set up a project where you own some solar panels, you get a few quid that the community can spend every year to fix the church roof or whatever it is. I think that's an unfair perception of community energy, although it's not necessarily been untrue over the years. But community energy, community ownership at its best in the energy system, you can do it on a large scale. We have communities taking ownership of massive turbines. We have communities taking ownership, sometimes in partnership with developers, of huge solar farms that generate up to hundreds of thousands of pounds per year. All that money is spent democratically. It's owned democratically. You can scale that out to include your local council representatives, to include local businesses, industry, trade unions, social justice organisations, to all have an ownership and a governance stake within that, running that sort of mini energy system, running the profits, the governance of that system for their own ends, democratically spent, where they have power over the whole equation. That is a very infectious thing. I've never been to a community organisation. I've never been into a community centre and given a talk where people didn't fucking love the idea. It's difficult just now to do it because government, as much as they want to support it, see it as a little bit of a kind of nice to have. We'll do the big stuff, and here's a few quid so that communities can also have a few things. But when you do it well, and when you build it up with those wider democratic principles, actually it's a massive challenge to it has to be profitable for it to be possible or for it to be good. And you can start to run things in the interest of the people in the planet at the end of the system, rather than the business case of its own accord. So start Community Energy Group in St Andrews. That's my big pitch to you.
And that is also the answer to the former question of how to get to the transition in 25 years.
Yes.
I suggest that we end here with this very kind of passionate call to action and this kind of optimism that there's things we could be doing, we should be doing. They might be difficult, but there is space for action and optimism amidst all of the complexities. So please join me in saying big thank you to our panelists.